Hello. And as you can see, Kimberley Lewis, Director of Engagement at Federated Hermes International, is now with us. Firstly, Kimberley, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the presentation and that great insights. And welcome to the Responsible Business Europe event.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And I look forward to posing some questions to you now in the next 15 minutes. So I'm going to dive straight in. So diversity and inclusion has been a topic of discussion in the sustainability ESG circuit for a number of years, and it's really started to gain prominence over the past couple of years. So, but it has been catapulted to the front of both business and society this year with the pandemic, the Black Lives Movement, and they're just two reasons we've seen it come up to great prominence in this space. So, but I've got, I suppose, a question around a consideration or a warning, because in our industry we've seen greenwash, we've seen purpose wash, we've seen SDG wash. So there is a concern I have that number of companies will see this as a thing where they can, without it sounding bad, jump on the bandwagon, put out information, PR, marketing, without actually understanding the complexities of the issues within diversity and inclusion. So, what are your thoughts here? And what maybe words of warnings for those listening?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a very real concern. And that's where authenticity really is the key. There has been a move amongst a lot of companies to instantly sort of make statements and commitments of what they were going to do and what actions they were going to take. In some cases, they were already in a position to make those sorts of statements quickly. Perhaps it was the conversations they'd already been having internally, and so it was entirely appropriate that they would be able to sort of respond quickly with specific kind of measurable, bold actions, and we applaud those. There are others that weren't as far along the journey until this the Black Lives Matter movement in this case, or COVID and seeing the impact of women, et cetera. And so they're rightfully taking the time to really think about what they should do, what's specific to them as a company, what they have the internal kind of desire, capacity, resource, et cetera, and do it, and are being a bit more deliberate about what they're saying and how. And I think that's a good thing. That is the key, is to really do the internal work, right? Because progression and diversity takes work. And so I think what companies need to really do is have a look, have the difficult conversations, the different internal strategy work, and look at what they can do that's unique to them. You see some companies, usually in all corporates, you kind of look to the left and look to the right and see what your competitors are doing, and then, sort of figure out whether you want to be best practice or sort of in the middle, and then you kind of measure yourself against your competitors. But that's not something, when it comes to diversity, that's necessarily a good idea, because every company is different and has different human capital management issues. So I would just say in that is to not, is to be deliberate, be thoughtful, be authentic about your company and what you are willing to do, as opposed to necessarily trying to kind of keep up with the Joneses, so to say.
Yeah.
But it's a constant, it's not one action. It's constantly, this is a marathon. So it's throughout the whole process of trying to achieve these actions that you're committing to, keeping them at the top of the radar, and keeping holding yourself accountable for walking the walk.
Yeah, and you know what, you mentioned authenticity a couple of times there, and it's a word we've heard over on Thursday and Friday when we was broadcasting. It's really being honest about where you are as a company, and because if you're not, in the world we live in, people can find it out anyway. So it's good that you said that. And I suppose once a company's looked and it's set itself targets, what are some of the steps that the companies can do to actually meet these targets?
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. So what we tell them to do is, because you're right, it's one thing to set them, but if you don't do anything differently, then you're not going to meet them. So we're looking for companies to set targets and then talk us through the interventions that they're looking to do, what they're going to do differently to achieve them. So we ask companies to really look at three areas, both recruiting, progression, and retention. Now, what we tend to do is we tend to see a lot of activity in the recruiting space, right? It's almost easier. Well, this is, and I think it's important, whether it's colorblind CVs, or we are going to request diverse slate of candidates from all recruiters, or we are going to have internship programs or whatever. We've seen some really interesting creative things on the recruitment space, and that's really, really exciting. But the areas that we also that are important and that go alongside with that are around promotion and retention. So we really want companies to think about, once you get these folks in to the pipeline, look at, are you keeping stats about your, what we call promotion velocity? Are you looking at, if we, the average length of time that women are getting promoted versus, or people of color, or whatever your targeted demographic group is for your strategy versus other groups? Are you looking at your actual process itself and whether or not it is objective and subject to potential unconscious bias? And then on the retention side, then there's other issues. Are you doing, what are you engaging your employees? Are you finding out, are you doing exit interviews? Are they finding out why they're leaving? Are you finding out how they're finding their experience when they're staying? So we think that it's important that companies not only look at how to bring folks in, but also how to keep them and progress them throughout the organization. And those are the two pieces of meeting the targets that we're really encouraging companies to have a look at. And really think through. Because in the leaky pipelines, which is what we see in gender diversity, those are really the issues. We tend to see underrepresented demographics overrepresented in the lower tiers of the organization and underrepresented in the higher tiers. So we want companies to really think through the entire sort of life cycle of an employee at their company.
Okay, and before we went live, we briefly spoke about a couple of points, and one I find very interesting. It's something I see gaining momentum, at least in terms of looking at the actions and the possible I suppose steps that companies can take, is around the board of directors. And there's 2 points, I suppose, or 2 questions to pose around here. One, firstly, the board of directors traditionally hasn't been a diverse group, so they're overseeing a company and the strategy that it deploys. So what actions are needed there, I suppose? What can companies do on that aspect? But secondly, the board of directors traditionally haven't, I think there's a study recently that they don't have the skill set, or a very small minority have a skill set within sustainability. So how, there needs to be some work with them. What role can they play, and what role should they play to help on the D&I? And I suppose, how can they be skilled to do that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the board of directors is a really important area from the investor's perspective, because obviously that's the area where we, that's the group that we ultimately see as accountable to investors as one of their key stakeholders. That's the group that we can vote for and against. And so it is a very important relationship, and it's an important lever for investors to use to express our views on expectations of companies' actions on diversity. So yes, you made a very good observation that board diversity in and of itself is an important issue. And that's, that could be a separate panel.
Yes.
but so we certainly encourage board diversity. But interestingly, there have been some studies that show that there's not even necessarily a correlation between the diversity on the board and diversity throughout the workforce. So in some countries that we've seen that have had actually gender diverse boards have had some of the least diverse gender diversity throughout senior leadership and throughout the organization. So our kind of initial assumption that we think about board diversity trickling down throughout the organization doesn't necessarily happen. There's much more of a correlation between executive team diversity and diversity throughout other levels of the workforce. But as far as board themselves, we have really been encouraging boards, and I think you're seeing a lot more kind of momentum in this space of investors encouraging the board to be a lot more active in how they engage the CEO and the executive team on overall, not just diversity, but all human capital management issues. Diversity is obviously an incredibly important part of a company's human capital management strategy. And human capital is, should be treated just as any other capital allocation decision, or with the same amount of import, particularly given the percentage of companies' expenditures that human capital is, and what it contributes to its product and services. So we would say this: one, it is important that there is a process to oversee and to look at key human capital measurements at every board meeting. There should be, now we're seeing sometimes that being delegated to one committee, sometimes it's the audit committee, sometimes there's delegated one board member specifically as a human capital management overseer. We're seeing that take different forms. We think every board should be having a conversation about how it is monitoring the key human capital management indicators, diversity being a very important one of those. The second, an area where the board does have direct influence, is with the CEO and the executive team. And it does have the authority to include diversity in the exec comp of the CEO. So that's a very tangible way that a board can make an impact on the human capital management, at least of the executive leader or the diversity of the executive leadership team. The other thing I would say is really kind of get it involved with the workforce. We've seen in some companies actually board members not only doing site visits, but also when doing site visits and office visits, actually meeting with employees without the CEO executive team member there, sort of focus groups of diverse sets of employees. So we are seeing some very creative ways in which boards are exercising more oversight over the composition of the workforce, and we urge that to continue.
And you mentioned, I'm just conscious of time, so I want to get for a couple of questions in the last few minutes. So
Sure.
You mentioned there around measurement, and you mentioned it a couple of times as we've spoken. So data collection is critical to this, but it comes with a whole host of challenges, especially under the S of ESG. So what are your thoughts around that? What ideas or suggestions on that aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is, right? You can't set goals and targets and strategies quantitatively if you do not have the data. We will, it is generally less difficult with gender, right? Most companies, particularly in Europe, since they, in the UK, since they've got to report for gender pay gap or collect data for women in finance charter or other regulations, voluntarily or involuntarily. We've heard less of, it's very rare we hear companies having a challenge with collecting gender data. The question is that it becomes more difficult with ethnicity. Now, in the US, companies are required to collect and regularly report on ethnicity data, and they're required to use visual observation if they have not gotten it from the employee. It is not the case in Europe. In fact, some countries, companies cannot collect ethnic demographic data like in France. In the UK, where they can do it, it is trickier to, sorry, my connection is,
You're still
okay,
here.
Okay,
I can
great.
still hear you. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that. So,
that's okay.
In the UK, it is trickier, and companies are having legitimate challenges. Well-meaning companies who would like to have the data are having a difficulty collecting it, less with new employees, but with its existing workforce, right? And kind of going back and retroactively categorizing its current employees. What we are encouraging companies to do is treat this like a campaign, right? Treat internal data collection like any other campaign it would do. Campaign to get engagement reports done, campaign to get, employees to respond to any one of a number of employees that you have. And a campaign involves one, educating, let your workforce know what you're doing and why, and then B, having the processes in place to making it easy for employees to collect and submit data, and also really encouraging managers to play an active role and have incentives for managers in getting high response rates to its data collection. So it's not as straightforward as it is in the US, and there are legitimate challenges, but we're seeing some real creativity with companies in terms of how they're collecting this data and encouraging their employees to report.
Okay, we've had, I'm going to try and pose one quick question. Hopefully you can answer it simple yes or no, or a simple one line response, and then maybe one final question to end on. So relating to the data question, we've had a question here from someone around, is there the same weighting to, say, for instance, around disability to ethnicity and gender? So how would you qualify the inclusion of people with disabilities in your criteria ranking? Has it got the same weight as other criteria as ethnicity and gender?
I don't see it as a weighting. I'm trying to give you a short, direct answer, but I don't think there's a weighting. I don't think there's a level of import to various
the level of
importance.
It's not.
Yeah. It's
okay. So there is no, I suppose, more important than other. It's the same. There's a cross-board approach, I suppose, on that.
Right. I would just say they'll also look at the representation of that demographic group in society. So, for example, women are roughly 50%. So obviously, that's a larger group that you're going to be focusing on. So I think that would be, look as it relative to the overall population of your potential workforce.
Okay. And final question. And we've got a number of investors watching today's broadcast. So what can investors do to encourage companies to make progress on ethnic diversity?
I think there are two things. I think there are three things, actually. I think one is voting, right? Investors have, as I mentioned before, investors have the power to vote and express their views, for the board members and then insert the board conversation that we've just had. But secondly, engagement, active engagement, be active owners, speak to the companies throughout the year, not just around the AGM, be really clear about what your expectations are, ask for this data. If you don't have the data, ask the companies to report it. There are a lot of very good benchmarking and frameworks that companies can use to report to investors their diversity data. So actively engage throughout the year companies and make clear your expectations on the diversity of their workforce. And thirdly, investors and companies can look inward at themselves and work on their own diversity, as it would for any company that engages.
That's brilliant. Well, Kimberley, thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for the presentation and joining the Q&A, and thank you to you and your colleagues for supporting this year's event. Great to have you plugged in and great to hear your insights, and all I can say is keep up the great work.
Thanks, Liam. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.